remember the smell first. Something metallic in the air, sharp enough that I could taste it on the back of my tongue as I stumbled through the hallway. The house was too quiet in the way only a dangerous night can be quiet, like everything around me was holding its breath. He had been angry again, not shouting this time. That would have been easier to explain. His silence was always worse, a kind of cold pressure that filled every room we shared. I had learned to read that silence years before tonight, but even knowing what was coming never helped me stop it. I do not remember the exact moment when everything turned. There had been a slammed door, a sentence cut in half, a quick movement I could not track. A hand maybe. A pull. A shove. My shoulder hitting the edge of the hallway wall. Then, something else. A blur. The floor rushing toward me faster than I could think. People always assume the scariest part of losing consciousness is the darkness. That is not true. The scariest part is the moment right before the darkness closes in, when you realize your body is no longer yours to control. I felt that moment as something like a drop inside my chest, a falling without moving. I tried to grab the edge of the console table by the stairs. My fingers brushed wood, then slipped off. Then there was nothing, a slow sinking, a distant echo, then lights. Too bright, too white, too close. I opened my eyes and realized I was lying on a hospital gurney. Voices moved around me like water, muffled and overlapping. Someone adjusted a strap near my wrist. Another voice said something about blood pressure. A nurse leaned over me with a flashlight. Her expression flickered, shifting from clinical focus to something like concern. She asked what happened. I tried to answer, but the words tangled inside my mouth. Before I could form anything clear, my mother spoke. She stepped forward as if she had been waiting for her cue. Her voice was calm in a way that made the room feel colder. "She is always clumsy." She said it with a soft sigh, as if she had already apologized for me 1,000 times and expected to do it 1,000 more. My mother did not look at me when she said it. She looked at the nurse, the doctor, the people who might ask questions. She wanted to control the story before I could even understand what story was being told. I turned my head slightly and saw my brother standing near the foot of the bed. His arms were crossed. His face was relaxed. Then, something unbelievable happened. He laughed, not loud, not mocking exactly, but a small, amused breath that pushed the air through his nose as if this entire thing were inconvenient and familiar. He looked at the nurse and said, "She makes a scene sometimes." His tone was light, casual, practiced. I had heard it before at family gatherings when I disagreed with him or tried to defend myself. That tone always made people roll their eyes and assume the problem was me. I wanted to ask why he was laughing, why he was not afraid, why none of them were acting like a daughter and sister had just been rushed into an emergency room unconscious. But I could not get the words out. My tongue felt thick. My throat was dry and raw. My vision kept blurring at the edges. The doctor asked about the fall. My father answered instead. He said I had been tired lately, overworked, stressed. He said the word stressed like it explained everything anyone needed to know. I listened to them build their explanation with quiet efficiency. A fall, a clumsy moment, a tired mind, a stressed woman. Not one of them looked at me to check if I agreed. Not one of them hesitated. Not one of them asked if I needed to speak for myself. I felt something tightening in my chest, a slow panic crawling up my ribs. I tried to lift my hand, and a sharp ache shot through my wrist. The nurse noticed and asked again what had happened. My mother spoke over her. "It is nothing. She does this." I tried to shake my head. It must have been barely noticeable because my brother snorted again. The nurse frowned. For a second, I thought she might insist, but my father stepped closer. "We have it handled." That was the moment something cold settled inside me, a realization sharper than pain. My family was not afraid I might die. They were afraid I might talk. As the doctor ordered scans and the nurse prepared to wheel me out, I stared at the ceiling and felt the weight of their story pressing down on mine. They were building a version of events where nothing was wrong and nothing needed to change. A version where I was the problem before anyone even asked. I wanted to scream, but the sound stayed trapped behind my teeth. The last thing I saw before they moved the gurney was my brother leaning against the wall, arms still crossed, a faint smile lingering on his face like this was nothing new. Maybe for him, it was not. Maybe for them, this was exactly the place they expected me to end up. Clumsy, unstable, embarrassing, easier to explain as an accident than as the truth. And lying there under those fluorescent lights, I understood with a clarity that felt like a wound. If I wanted my story told, I would have to survive long enough to tell it myself. When I woke again, the room was quieter than before, the kind of quiet that comes after people have already decided what they want the truth to be. A soft beeping near my ear told me I was still in the emergency room, but everything else felt strangely distant. The overhead lights were dimmer now, replaced by a single lamp near the monitor. My head throbbed with a slow, pulsing ache that made it hard to track time or sound. When I tried to shift my body, the blanket dragged across my legs with a weight that felt heavier than fabric. For a moment, I thought maybe I had dreamed the way my mother had stepped forward and spoken for me, or the way my brother had laughed, but then I heard voices on the other side of the curtain. They were whispering, but not quietly enough. My mother said something about making sure the doctor understood that the last few weeks had been stressful for me. My father murmured in agreement, his voice steady and authoritative in the way he used to speak to teachers when I was a child. They were crafting something aligning details, smoothing the edges of an explanation that had nothing to do with what actually happened. It took me a few seconds to realize they were doing it again. They were telling a story for me. The doctor entered with a clipboard against his chest, glancing between the three of us. He asked how I was feeling. I could not trust my voice yet, so I nodded carefully. Before he could continue, my mother stepped to the foot of the bed. She told him I had fainted before. She used the word spells, which she had never used in her life until tonight. She told him I had always been the type to get overwhelmed. She said it with that same gentle apologetic tone she used in grocery stores when I cried as a child, or in parent-teacher meetings where she explained why my grades were inconsistent. I tried to open my mouth, feeling my throat pull in protest. I wanted to say that none of this was true. I wanted to correct even one small piece of what she said. But my words came out slow and blurred, and my mother used that silence as proof. See, she gets confused. She said it almost kindly, as if she were worried for me. The doctor made a few notes while my father added another layer to the narrative. He told the doctor I had been working late hours. He said I looked pale all week. He mentioned the word exhaustion with a calm finality that made it sound reasonable. These words fit together neatly like pieces of a puzzle designed long before tonight. Stress, exhaustion, spells, confusion, clumsiness. They had created a full explanation complete with a beginning, a middle, and an ending that did not leave room for the truth. When the doctor asked me whether this was accurate, my mother answered for me again. She said I was embarrassed and tired. She said I would explain more once I felt better. I tried to shake my head, but my father placed a hand on the railing of the bed and told me to rest. His eyes were steady on mine, the same way he looked at me when I was younger and about to say something he did not want me to say. It was not anger. It was a warning. I closed my eyes because it was the only form of resistance I had left. The discharge instructions were printed and handed to my parents before I even understood I had been cleared to leave. The doctor said there were no alarming signs on the scans. He recommended rest and follow-up if symptoms worsened. There was nothing in the paperwork about the cause of the injury, nothing about the possibility of assault, nothing that reflected the fear that had lived inside my chest every day for months. My mother took the papers as if they belonged to her and tucked them neatly into her purse. She thanked the doctor for being understanding. My brother stood near the door tapping a rhythm on his phone with a bored expression. When the nurse removed the IV, she leaned close and asked whether I had someone I trusted who could stay with me tonight. I barely had a second to answer before my mother responded. She has us. We will take care of everything. The nurse hesitated and her eyes lingered on me with something like suspicion or concern. But she nodded and stepped back. They helped me up slowly. My legs trembled and my vision flickered, but my family formed a wall around me. My mother held my elbow too tightly. My father walked ahead and managed the paperwork. My brother followed behind with his hands in his pockets. I felt trapped in the middle of them, as if they were escorting me rather than helping me. When we stepped outside, the cold night air hit my face like a slap that did not hurt. It woke something in me, a clarity, a quiet dread. As they guided me toward the car, I listened to them talk about me as if I were not standing between them. My mother said we will tell people she fainted. My father said that is what happened. My brother said she always does something dramatic. Their words were low, but not low enough. They did not care if I heard them because in their minds, the story was already finished. I slid into the back seat, feeling the fabric press against my bruised ribs. As the car pulled away from the hospital, I realized the truth they feared was still inside me, unspoken but alive. And I understood with a heavy certainty that they were not trying to protect me from the world. They were trying to protect the world from knowing who they really were. I spent the ride home drifting in and out of a fog, but not the kind caused by the injury. It was the fog of memory, the kind that pulls you backward through the years and forces you to see patterns you ignored or explained away. My mother liked to say I had always been difficult. She used that word the way other mothers used gifted or spirited, a label that was spoken with an affectionate sigh in public but held a sting when we were alone. Even as a child, I understood that difficult meant something was wrong with me, not with the family that constantly reshaped itself around my brother. He was the golden one from the moment he learned to walk. People said he had charm. What they meant was that adults liked him and he liked the way they looked at him. Teachers praised his confidence even when it tipped into arrogance. Coaches said he was a natural leader even when he shoved other kids aside. My parents repeated those words so often that they became a foundation under him and a ceiling over me. When I struggled in school, my mother said I made things harder than they needed to be. When I cried after being bullied, she said I was too sensitive. When I stayed in my room to avoid arguments, my father said I was moody. My brother would lean against the doorway and laugh, telling me I was dramatic. That word clung to me for years, even though I barely spoke up. I learned early that disagreeing made things explode, so I tried to shrink myself. But shrinking never worked for long. No matter how quiet I became, my existence seemed to irritate the balance of the household. If I got good grades, my brother accused me of showing off. If I struggled, my parents said I was not applying myself. If I made a friend, my brother would find a way to insert himself until I drifted away from that person. If I dated someone, he would make jokes until the relationship cracked apart. Everything in our house revolved around maintaining my brother's shine. My mother smoothed out his mistakes and exaggerated mine until she believed her own exaggerations. My father defended him even when he was cruel, saying boys tease and girls overreact. Whenever I tried to explain how it felt, the adults in my life assured me my family meant well. They told me every family had tension. They told me siblings fought. They told me I was too sensitive again and again until the phrase burrowed into my bones. By the time I was in high school, I had perfected the art of keeping my face still while my insides churned. My brother grew louder and more admired while I learned to process everything internally. The gap widened in ways no one bothered to question. My brother got attention privileges, forgiveness. I got advice. Mostly unwanted advice delivered as gentle corrections. Try harder. Be nicer. Do not take things personally. Calm down. Let it go. I absorbed these instructions because resisting them only made my mother tilt her head and sigh the way she did in the emergency room. A sigh that meant I was proving her right. I remember one particular night just before graduation. I had won an award for a project that took me weeks of research and late nights. My parents congratulated me with mild surprise and then made the evening about my brother getting accepted into a competitive sports program. We sat around the dinner table while they discussed his schedule and future plans. Every word they spoke felt like a layer of invisibility settling over me. When I excused myself to my room, my brother shouted, "Don't be so dramatic!" The entire table laughed. That sound still echoes inside my head because it was the moment I finally understood that the world in that house had roles, and mine was never going to be the admired one. Years later, when I introduced the man who would become my partner, my parents welcomed him with unusual warmth. He was polite in a controlled way that impressed adults. He complimented my mother and helped my father with small tasks. My brother liked him because he listened more than he spoke. My family saw all of this as maturity and dependability. They said he was steady and good for me as if I were some volatile storm needing to be managed. I mistook their approval for a sign that the relationship was safe. I did not yet understand that my family liked him because he fit their picture of what I should be: quiet, contained, directed by someone else. Looking back, it is hard to pinpoint the exact moment when my partner's guidance turned into control. It came gradually, like the slow tightening of a rope. Suggestions became expectations. Expectations became rules. Rules became consequences. I adapted the way I always had. I softened myself. I avoided saying things that might upset him. I apologized for emotions that were normal. I convinced myself that maybe my mother had been right all along. Maybe I was difficult. Maybe everyone was trying to help me be better. My family encouraged this narrative with subtle praise. They said I seemed calmer. They said he was patient with me. They said it was good that he looked out for me. They did not call it control. They called it stability. So when the bruises started appearing months later, my family did not ask questions. They gave the answers instead. Clumsy, stressed, sensitive, overwhelmed, dramatic. The same vocabulary they had used on me all my life. It did not matter that my instincts whispered something different. Survival teaches you not to trust instincts when everyone around you insists their version is the truth. Sitting in the back seat after the emergency room listening to my parents and brother repeat those familiar words, I realized something unsettling. They had not created a new story for tonight. They had simply pulled from the same script they had used on me since childhood. A lifetime of shaping me into the difficult one had prepared them for this moment. And without hesitation, they stepped into their roles as if this was exactly how the story was always meant to go. My parents liked him instantly. That should have been the first warning, but back then, I mistook their approval for safety. I had spent so much of my life being told I was too sensitive or too dramatic that when someone appeared who fit neatly into their expectations, I felt relief instead of caution. They saw him as the answer to a question they believed I had never been able to solve on my own. A man who could steady me. A man who could correct the parts of me they called difficult. He walked into our family as if he had studied the role beforehand. He shook my father's hand, firmly complimented his work, and asked questions that made my father feel knowledgeable. My mother glowed under the attention. He listened to her stories without interrupting, smiled at her opinions, and offered to help clean the dishes after dinner. My brother watched him with an approving nod, the kind he rarely gave anyone, let alone someone connected to me. In their eyes, he was calm and disciplined. In mine, he was charming, in a practiced and polished way, always aware of the effect he had on people. My parents mistook that awareness for maturity. They called him thoughtful. They said he was good for me. They said he would bring out the best in me. It did not occur to me then how often those words had been used to justify control. In the beginning, he was attentive. Not affectionate or warm exactly, but observant. He noticed what I wore, what I ate, which friends I saw, how I reacted to things. He remembered small details and asked questions that made me feel seen. No one had paid that kind of attention to me before without following it with a sigh about my emotions or a lecture about my choices. At first, it felt like connection. Then it began to feel like surveillance. The shift was gradual. It never happened in one dramatic moment. It began with preferences. He preferred when I wore neutral colors. He preferred when I answered my phone on the first ring. He preferred when I stayed home after work instead of going out. He preferred when I asked his opinion before making decisions. Each preference sounded harmless. Each one slid into my routine silently. When something made me uncomfortable, he explained why it was logical, why it was better for me, why he was helping me avoid mistakes. Whenever I hesitated, he gave me that look, the one that suggested I was overreacting. My mother used the same look. It made me doubt myself in familiar ways. He told me I talked too much in group settings. He told me I misread people's intentions. He told me I needed structure. He said it all with a steady patience that sounded reasonable. He never raised his voice. Control is easier to miss when it arrives without volume. My parents applauded every change in me. They said I seemed calmer. They said he grounded me. My father admired the way he spoke firmly but politely. My mother said I was lucky to have someone so stable. My brother joked that someone finally knew how to handle me. The more they praised him, the more I tried to meet the version of me they believed he could mold. I thought that if I followed all the unspoken rules, life would be easier. For a while, it was. Or maybe it only felt easier because I had stopped resisting. The first real shift happened after an argument so small I cannot remember how it started. Something about a message I had not responded to quickly enough. His expression changed in a way I had never seen, a tightening around the eyes, a hard stillness. He stepped closer and spoke softly, but with an edge that cut deeper than shouting. He said I needed to choose who I wanted to be. Someone who caused problems or someone who avoided them. He framed it as a choice, even though it was not. I apologized. I promised to do better. I thought that would be the end of it. Instead, it was the beginning. After that night, his attentiveness sharpened. His questions became checks. His corrections became rules. He monitored what I said and how I said it. If I expressed discomfort, he said I was imagining things. If I pushed back, he stared at me in that quiet way until I felt small. My parents interpreted his behavior as dedication. They loved how he stayed involved in everything. They said it showed commitment. They said he was invested in my well-being. They never once asked whether his investment felt suffocating. They did not want a version of me with opinions or boundaries. They wanted a version of me that required management because that meant they had always been right about who I was. The more he tightened his grip, the more my family praised him. Whenever I looked uncomfortable at gatherings, my mother said I was tired. Whenever I went silent during conversations, my father said I overthought things. Whenever my brother saw tension between us, he smirked and said I was probably being dramatic again. They did not see what happened when the door closed behind us. They did not hear the slow, precise criticisms that chipped away at what little confidence I had. They did not see the way he observed me like someone analyzing a puzzle with a missing piece. They did not notice how I grew quieter each month. Or maybe they did notice. Maybe they preferred it. He fit so perfectly into the world my family had built that for a long time I believed they had chosen well. It took me years to understand that they did not choose him because he loved me. They chose him because he reinforced the version of me they had decided was true, a version that was easier for them to manage, a version that could not contradict their story. The first bruise did not frighten me. It should have, but it did not. I had spent most of my life being told I was sensitive, clumsy, forgetful, dramatic, scattered, and easily overwhelmed. When you grow up being given a list of flaws that long it becomes second nature to assume that every unpleasant thing must somehow be your fault. So when I noticed the mark on my arm the next morning, faint but undeniable, I stared at it with a strange sense of detachment. I tried to piece together what had happened the night before, but the memory felt slippery. I remembered tension. I remembered an argument about something so small it now felt unreal. I remembered that same cold pressure in the room. After that, everything blurred. I told myself maybe I bumped into something. Maybe I rolled onto the corner of the nightstand. Maybe I bruised easily. That was my first excuse. Not his, mine. When my mother saw it a few days later, she did not look alarmed. She barely paused before saying, "You always bruise like a peach." She said it with a light laugh, the same one she used whenever I tripped over my own feet as a child. My father glanced up long enough to say, "Be more careful." My brother smirked and said, "You should play a sport so your body toughens up." I laughed along with them even though the sound felt hollow. I had always been the one who needed to adjust, not them. So I adjusted again. After that, new marks appeared slowly, each one with a freshly invented explanation. One on my hip from bumping into a countertop. One on my ribs from twisting too hard while cleaning. One on my thigh from carrying groceries. Each one required a little more imagination. Each one was harder to deny. When I tried to bring it up to him, his expression barely changed. His voice remained calm as he told me I misremembered things. He said I panicked too easily. He said I always jumped to conclusions. At first, he framed it as reassurance. "You are fine. You get overwhelmed." Nothing happened. When I pressed again, he leaned in close, his eyes steady and unblinking. "Are you accusing me of something?" The question hung between us like a threat disguised as concern. The thing about being raised in a family where your feelings are dismissed is that you learn to apologize even when you are the one who is afraid. I apologized that night, not because he deserved it, but because I had been conditioned to soothe everyone around me. My mother used to say keeping the peace is a skill. What she meant was silence is survival. And I slipped back into silence without even realizing it. The bruises continued, some small, some impossible to hide. When my mother noticed a deep mark along my shoulder, she pursed her lips but chose the explanation before I could speak. "You lift things wrong, I told you that." My father nodded and said she has always been careless. My brother shrugged and said she walks into walls. They laughed again, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of habit. That was how they managed anything uncomfortable. They made it my fault and treated it lightly until it became the accepted truth. I started whispering those explanations to myself in the mirror. It was easier to believe the family script than to face the growing fear in my chest. If I allowed myself to name what was happening, then I would have to confront the reality that no one I loved would believe me. The moment that finally cracked me happened on a Sunday afternoon while we were getting ready for dinner with my parents. I reached for a dress and winced when the fabric brushed against a bruise along my ribs. He saw the flinch and stepped behind me, placing a hand on my waist. His grip tightened just enough to make me catch my breath. Then he said softly, "You need to be careful. People will think you are hurting yourself." The words were delivered with such measured politeness that it felt like a warning wrapped in silk. In the car on the way to dinner, my brother joked about how often I appeared with bruises. My mother said she had always been accident-prone. My father shook his head and called me clumsy. They all said these things while I sat between them, my ribs throbbing, my fingertips numb. The more they repeated their version, the more my own reality slipped out of reach. By the time dessert was served, I felt disconnected from my own body, floating somewhere above the conversation, watching myself nod along. That night, alone in the bathroom, I lifted my shirt and counted the marks. 7. 7 separate injuries in less than 3 weeks. My reflection stared back at me with wide, frightened eyes, and for a moment I did not recognize myself. I tried to speak the truth out loud, but the words refused to come. Every phrase my family had ever used to define me echoed in my mind like a script I had memorized too well. Sensitive, dramatic, overreacting, confused, difficult. The bruises should have been evidence, but in my world, they were simply another reason to doubt myself. The cycle deepened so quietly that I barely noticed the shift. I told myself I deserved patience. I told myself he did not mean it. I told myself accidents happened. I told myself everyone else seemed calm, so maybe I was the one who needed to adjust. Looking back, the worst lie I told myself was this one. If my family did not believe the bruises were real problems, then maybe they were not. That was how deeply their excuses lived inside me. That was how easily I surrendered my own voice without understanding I was losing it. The second time I ended up in the emergency room, I was fully conscious, which somehow made everything worse. There is a particular humiliation in walking through those sliding glass doors under your own power while every part of your body aches from things you are not supposed to name. I remember pressing my hand against my side as I stepped inside, trying to hide the way each breath came tight and shallow. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee. A television hummed in the background, showing a cooking show no one was watching. I approached the intake desk and gave my name. The nurse glanced at me once, then twice, her eyes briefly dropping to the way I held myself. She asked what brought me in tonight. The answer caught in my throat. I told her I had fallen. I winced even hearing myself say it. She raised an eyebrow but did not challenge me. Instead, she handed me a clipboard and told me to take a seat. As I lowered myself into the plastic chair, a sharp pain shot through my ribs. I inhaled sharply. The woman across from me, flipping through a magazine, glanced up and then looked away quickly. People know. Even when they pretend they do not know, they know. After what felt like an eternity, a nurse called my name. I followed her down a hallway lined with curtained rooms. She led me into one and closed the curtain behind us. She took my vitals quietly, professionally. Then she asked the question I had been dreading. "Are you safe at home?" She did not say it loudly. She said it with a calm neutrality that felt practiced and kind at the same time. I froze. No one had ever asked me that before, not like this. Her eyes stayed on mine. I opened my mouth, but before any sound could come out, the curtain snapped open. My mother stepped inside. My father followed her. My brother came in last, leaning casually against the wall as if we were in a restaurant waiting to be seated. My mother spoke first. We came as soon as we heard. It sounded rehearsed. The nurse did not move. She repeated her question. I said, "Are you safe at home?" My mother stepped forward and answered for me. "Of course she is. She gets overwhelmed. She had another one of her spells." My father nodded. "She has been under a lot of stress. Work, family, everything." My brother smirked. "She worries herself sick over nothing." The nurse looked at each of them slowly, her gaze settling on me again. She asked if she could speak to me alone for a moment. My mother smiled tightly. "She always wants alone time. It is part of the problem." My father added, "She gets confused when she is upset." The nurse hesitated. Then my brother spoke. "She falls a lot. You learn not to panic." The nurse looked frustrated, but professional enough not to show it fully. That was the moment I wanted more than anything to tell the truth. I felt the words gathering like pressure in my chest. The nurse stepped closer and asked softly, "Is there anything you want to tell me?" But the weight of my family standing behind me tightened around my throat like a binding. They were not glaring. They did not need to. Their presence alone said everything. If I spoke, I would be alone in a way that terrified me more than the pain. So I shook my head. The nurse exhaled and nodded slowly. She continued her assessment while my family stayed in the room like guards posted at a door I was not allowed to open. When the doctor arrived, he asked how I was injured. My mother answered before he finished the sentence. "She fainted. She has done this before." My father added she needs to slow down. She pushes herself too hard. My brother said she is dramatic when she is hurt. The doctor looked at them for a moment, then at me. I tried to speak, but the pain flared again. He ordered an X-ray. For a few minutes they wheeled me away and my family stayed behind. The quiet felt like oxygen. In the radiology room, the technician asked how this happened. I whispered, "I fell." The lie tasted bitter. He looked unconvinced, but did not push. When they brought me back to the room, my family was waiting. My mother perched on the chair, my father pacing, my brother scrolling through his phone. They looked irritated, not worried. The doctor returned with the results, a cracked rib. He explained the treatment plan, the breathing exercises, the need to monitor for complications. My mother said, "See, she is always hurting herself." My father ran a hand through his hair and said, "At least it is not worse." My brother laughed under his breath. I felt the nurse look at me again, something sharp and understanding in her eyes. She handed me discharge papers and said, "If things ever change, come back." She emphasized the words, "if things ever change," in a way that made my heart twist. I wanted to ask what would happen if I told the truth. I wanted to ask whether anyone would believe me. But my family gathered around me again before I could speak. On the way out, my brother walked beside me and said, "You have to stop making everything a big deal." My father held the door open and said, "Accidents happen." My mother touched my arm lightly and whispered, "You do not want people thinking you are unstable." As we stepped into the cold night air, I realized something had shifted. Not in them, in me. The nurse saw something. She asked the question my family refused to let me answer. For the first time since everything began, I felt the smallest flicker of doubt. Not doubt in myself, doubt in the story my family had forced me to repeat. And that flicker, tiny as it was, felt like the beginning of something dangerous. Because once you start doubting the story, you eventually start looking for the truth. And the truth was becoming harder to ignore. The days after the second emergency room visit passed in a strange, slow blur, the kind where every hour feels stretched thin, but also heavy with something unnamed. I tried to rest, but rest did not come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the nurse asking if I was safe at home, and I heard the way my mother answered for me before I could breathe. I tried to shake the memory off, but it clung to me like a film on my skin. My mother called the next morning before I had even gotten out of bed. Her voice was soft, almost musical, the same tone she used when I was sick as a child. She said, "We are just worried about you." She said I had scared everyone. She said the stress I had been under lately was too much for me to manage. She never asked what actually happened. She never asked if I hurt anywhere. She never asked if someone had caused the injury. Her concern only existed inside the story she had already chosen. My father stopped by in the afternoon. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, surveying me like he was assessing damage to a building he owned. He said, "You need to slow down." He said, "You push yourself too hard." He said, "You get overwhelmed and it shows." He never said, "I am concerned because you keep appearing in emergency rooms." He never said, "I want to understand why you look scared when someone walks behind you." Instead, he told me to rest. Then, he handed me a bag of vitamins he bought from the store and said these might help your mood. My brother sent a text later in the evening. It said, "Stop scaring Mom." That was all. No question about my ribs. No question about the pain. No mention of the nurse who watched him shrug off my injuries like they were personality quirks instead of signs of harm. He followed the text with an eye roll emoji. He always used humor as a shield and cruelty as a shortcut. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling something twist in my stomach. That small flicker of doubt I felt in the hospital began to burn a little brighter. Still, a lifetime of conditioning is powerful. When someone tells you who they think you are for long enough, part of you starts to believe them, even if another part is screaming for truth. The next morning, my mother called again with the same soft tone. She said she had been praying for me. She said she hated seeing me like this. Then she said the words that made my skin prickle. "You should talk to someone. Not about what happened. Not about fear. Not about the bruises." What she meant was talk to someone about yourself. About why you worry people. About why you faint. About why you create so much stress. She said counseling might help me understand what is happening inside me. I felt myself shrinking again the way I always did when my family framed my pain as my own creation. I told her I would think about it. She sounded relieved, as if I had agreed. That afternoon, she sent me a list of therapists, not trauma specialists or domestic violence experts. Instead, the list was full of counselors who specialized in stress management, emotional regulation, and family harmony. She texted, "See what fits your needs." My father called an hour later. He said I should take a week off work and stay with them. He said the house would be quiet and comforting. I pictured myself sitting in their living room while they watched me like a fragile object that might crack at any moment. I pictured them telling visitors I had been under pressure again. I pictured them using my presence in their home as evidence that I could not manage my own life. I told him I needed time to decide. He told me not to overthink. That word, again. Overthink. My brother did not call. He showed up instead. He knocked on my door without warning and let himself in when I did not reach it fast enough. He looked around like he was inspecting a crime scene. He asked, "Are you still not better?" I said I was healing. He shrugged. Then he told me I had always been dramatic after minor injuries. He said everyone was talking about how stressed I had been. He said Mom was scared I was slipping. Then he said the thing that made me go still. He said, "You have to stop telling other people about your issues." That is how rumors start. My breath caught. I had not told anyone anything, but the fear in his voice sounded like a warning. My family was preparing something. Every message, every call, every gentle correction. They were building a narrative again the same way they always had. A narrative where I was fragile, confused, overwhelmed, needing supervision, needing guidance, needing them. They did not acknowledge the bruises or the cracked rib. They acknowledged only the parts of the story that protected them. That evening, I received 3 voicemails from my mother. Her voice trembled with emotional precision. She said, "We are just worried about you." She said, "Please do not shut us out." She said, "You know how you get." She said, "We love you, but you need help." She said, "We will figure this out as a family." In every voicemail, the word we sounded heavier than the word help. It struck me then with sudden clarity. Their worry was not about me. Their worry was about maintaining control of the story. The one where nothing violent ever happened in our family. The one where my discomfort was labeled as confusion. the one where my injuries were called clumsiness, the one where the truth was too dangerous to acknowledge. As I listened to her messages again, I felt something inside me shift, a quiet breaking, a quiet awakening. For the first time, I wondered if their worry had nothing to do with protecting me at all. The following week unfolded with a kind of calculated gentleness that felt more suffocating than concern. My mother called every morning with the same soothing tone, the one she used whenever she wanted to guide me toward a decision she had already made. She said she had been thinking. She said she had talked to a few friends from church. She said everyone agreed that stress could make people act unlike themselves. She paused before delivering her conclusion the way someone pauses before handing over a prescription. She said, "Let us just get you some help." The phrasing struck me. Not, "you need help," which would have sounded accusatory, but "let us get you some help," as if this were a joint mission and not an intervention I had never asked for. My father echoed her that evening. He stopped by with a bag of groceries and placed them neatly on the counter without meeting my eyes. Then he said he thought it would be wise for me to talk to a professional. He said it calmly, logically, like he was suggesting a tune-up for a car that had been making odd noises. He used words like evaluation and baseline and routine. He never used the words fear or pain or harm, not even once. My brother showed up the next day and sat on my couch like it was his lounging while he scrolled through his phone. He did not look at me when he said, "Maybe try counseling." He followed it with a lazy shrug. "You have always needed extra attention." The comment hit me harder than I expected. It was delivered casually, not meant as cruelty, but it landed on me with the weight of every childhood dismissal attached to it. Extra attention, difficult, sensitive, dramatic, confused. They were repackaging those old labels into something clinical and calling it help. My mother sent me 3 names of counselors she had already contacted. She added the appointment times they offered. She wrote everything in a text filled with soft words and reassurance. She said you will feel better after you talk to someone. She said we all want the best for you. She said we are trying to support you. Then she sent a final message that chilled me more than any bruise ever had. She wrote people worry when you disappear into yourself. It sounded like concern, but it was actually a warning. It meant she had already started telling people her version of the story. It meant there was a narrative forming around me without my participation. I could feel their expectations tightening. They wanted me to attend counseling not because they believed anything was wrong in my home, but because they wanted evidence to support the idea that something was wrong in me. They wanted documentation. They wanted someone with credentials to say she is overwhelmed or she is emotionally unstable. They wanted to build a path that led away from the truth and toward a version of events they could present to anyone who questioned the bruises or the emergency room visits. A version where they were the devoted family trying to help their troubled daughter. I tried to imagine sitting in a therapist's office. I pictured my mother describing me to the counselor before I even arrived. I pictured my father presenting a calm, reasonable explanation for everything. I pictured my brother shaking his head with dramatic pity. I pictured myself walking into that room, already branded before I said a single word. Still, some part of me hoped maybe talking to someone would help me make sense of everything. That flicker of hope was quickly extinguished during a dinner at my parents' house. They insisted I come eat with them so we could talk as a family. My mother set the table with care, placing a bowl of soup in front of me as if I were sick. My father sat across from me with the posture of someone preparing for a meeting. My brother leaned back in his chair, arms folded, bored expression firmly in place. My mother began softly. She said we are worried. She repeated it slowly like she needed me to understand it was the foundation of everything that followed. She said she wanted me to rest more. She said she thought I should take a leave from work. She said I should stay with them for a while so they could support me. My father nodded along. He said sometimes people do not notice when they are slipping. He said stress can affect judgment. He said they could help me get back on track. My brother looked directly at me then and said something that made my stomach twist. He said you have always needed someone to tell you what to do. You are better when people guide you. His voice held no malice. That made it worse. He believed it. They all did. For a moment, I could not breathe. I realized then that the help they offered was not meant to lift me out of anything. It was designed to pull me deeper into their control. It was not a rescue. It was a containment. The conversation shifted when my mother mentioned something about speaking with a doctor she knew. She said he agreed an evaluation could provide clarity. She said the word clarity with such confidence that it felt rehearsed. I set my spoon down slowly. I asked what kind of evaluation. My father answered without hesitation. Just something routine, just to rule out issues, just to make sure you are thinking clearly. The word clearly made my skin prickle. My brother smiled. It was not a cruel smile. It was worse. It was certain. In that moment, I understood the betrayal fully. They had not listened to me. They had not asked what I needed. They had not questioned the injuries or the fear behind my eyes. They had only moved to protect the version of the world that kept them comfortable. And they were prepared to use my own words, my exhaustion, my confusion, my pain as evidence against me. When I left their house that night, I walked to my car with trembling hands. The sky was dark and the air cold, but for the first time the doubt inside me took shape. They were not trying to get me help. They were trying to get control. I did not realize how fast a family could turn conversations into documentation until the day I heard my mother repeating my own words with a precision that felt rehearsed. It happened during a short visit one she insisted on after sending 3 messages asking if I was eating and sleeping. I agreed to stop by for coffee, hoping it would calm whatever tension had been building, but the moment I stepped inside their house, I felt the atmosphere shift. My mother guided me to the kitchen table the same way someone might guide a guest toward a seat they wanted them to occupy. She asked how I was feeling. Not in a curious way, but in an evaluative way, as if she expected a specific answer. I told her I was tired and trying to rest. She nodded slowly, eyes sharpening in a way I almost missed. She repeated softly, "You said you are confused lately." I froze. I had not said that. I had said I was tired. But she looked satisfied, as if she had captured a useful detail. My father entered the kitchen and asked how I was doing. I said I was managing. He frowned and said, "You told us last week that you get disoriented when you are stressed." Again, I had not said anything like that. I felt a tightening in my chest. They were assigning words to me, shaping sentences in ways that made me sound unstable. My mother scribbled something in a small notebook she kept near the fridge. She never used to take notes. She said it helped her stay organized, but the way she angled her body made it clear she did not want me seeing what she wrote. When I asked what she was writing, she gave me a gentle smile and said just reminders. My brother arrived a few minutes later, letting himself in without knocking the way he always did. He glanced at me and then at my parents. He asked, "Have you been eating?" I said yes. He nodded as if confirming something and said, "You have not looked like yourself lately. Mom said you forget things." I stared at him, stunned. I had not forgotten anything, but he said it so casually that it sounded like a fact. Then he pulled out his phone, typed something, and gave my mother a quick nod. My stomach dropped. They were collecting statements. They were turning my exhaustion and fear and pain into evidence for a version of events they could present to others, a version that positioned them as caretakers and me as someone unraveling. It was like watching people build a case in real time, brick by brick. Every sentence they spoke, every detail they twisted, every note they wrote down was another layer added to a story I did not recognize. I excused myself to the bathroom and closed the door. I pressed my palms against the sink and stared at my reflection. I saw a tired woman with dark circles and bruised skin, someone who had been surviving for too long. But I did not see someone confused or unstable. I whispered the truth to myself because I needed to hear it in my own voice. I am not losing my mind. I am not confused. I am scared because something is wrong. When I stepped out of the bathroom, I heard my parents talking in low tones. My mother said she admitted she is confused. My father said the doctor will want that noted. My brother added, "It is better to have everything documented." The word documented hit me like a shove. Documented. They were taking my words or twisting them into versions that served their narrative. And suddenly, I understood why they wanted me in counseling. Not to help me, not to support me. They wanted someone with a title, Someone with credentials, someone with authority to confirm the story they were already writing. If I ever tried to speak up about the bruises or the fear or the control, they could point to those records and say she has been struggling. She said herself she was confused, she needed help, she misremembers, she exaggerates, she is emotional, she is fragile. That realization settled over me like ice. My words were no longer mine. They were tools being reshaped and repurposed by people who had spent my entire life defining me on their terms. When I returned to the kitchen, my mother placed a cup of tea in front of me. She watched me closely as I took a sip. Then, she said kindly, "We wrote down some of what you have shared with us. We think it may help when you speak to a professional." My father nodded and said it is best to be thorough. My brother added, "You do not want to forget important details." They framed it as support. But it was strategy, and the more they spoke, the clearer the pattern became. If I said I was tired, they wrote, "She is exhausted and unfocused." If I said I was scared, they wrote, "She is anxious and unstable." If I said I needed space, they wrote, "She isolates and withdraws." They were building a paper trail, a record, a file. My mother reached across the table and touched my hand gently. She said, "We all want what is best for you. You need to trust us." But the warmth in her voice no longer fooled me. It sounded like someone soothing a child while stealing something from her pocket. I pulled my hand back slowly. I realized then that silence had become dangerous. Not silence toward them, silence from me. Because every word I spoke was being turned against me. I drove home that evening with a hollow feeling in my chest. Their house grew smaller in the rearview mirror while the truth grew larger and sharper. If I wanted to survive this, I would have to start doing what they feared most. I would have to speak carefully, with intention, and eventually I would have to speak to someone who was not them. I woke the next morning with a clarity that felt foreign, as if a thin pane of fog that had settled over my mind for years had finally cracked. The realization that my family was documenting my words, twisting them, shaping them into something they could use, settled into my bones with a cold weight. But instead of collapsing under it, I felt something inside me sharpen. Silence had always been the language of survival in that house, but this time it needed to become something entirely different. Not fear, not submission, strategy. I made coffee and stood in the kitchen breathing slowly while I replayed the last few days. My mother writing in her notebook. My father summarizing things I never said. My brother nodding as if everything had been agreed upon in a private conversation I was not invited to. If I kept speaking freely, every word would become part of the story they were crafting. But if I stopped speaking, if I controlled what I shared, if I documented my own truth silently, I might finally have something powerful enough to defend myself when the moment came. That morning, I opened a blank notebook of my own. I wrote the date, the time, the pain level in my ribs, the fading bruises along my arm, the memory of my mother saying, "You said you were confused," when I had not said anything of the sort. I wrote the phrases my family used over and over. "We are worried. You forget things. You get overwhelmed. You need help." I wrote everything with a precision born from desperation. I documented what really happened in the emergency rooms. I wrote down the nurse's questions. The look in her eyes when she asked quietly, "Are you safe at home?" I wrote that my mother interrupted before I could answer. I wrote that my brother laughed when I arrived unconscious. I wrote the exact words. She makes a scene sometimes. I filled 2 pages that first day. Not with emotion, not with guesses. With facts, statements, times, observations. I needed a record that belonged to me and not to the narrative my family wanted to force around me. My phone buzzed around noon. A message from my mother. "Checking on you. Need anything?" I typed back 3 words. "I am fine." Nothing more. No details that could be reframed. No sentences that could be twisted. She replied instantly, asking what I had eaten and whether I had slept. I waited 15 minutes before responding. Slept enough. She sent a heart emoji, then another message saying, "Remember, we are here for you." I took a picture of the screen and added it to my growing file. My father called an hour later. His tone was firm in a way disguised as gentle. He said he had scheduled a preliminary appointment with the doctor he mentioned. He said it would be helpful to rule things out. I asked him what things. He hesitated only a second before saying, "Just clarity." That word again. I told him I would think about it. He asked if I was confused. I said no. Then I said I have to go. I documented the entire exchange as soon as we hung up. My silence unsettled them. I could feel it. When a scapegoat stops providing material, the people who depend on controlling the narrative start to panic. My brother showed up that evening without warning. He pushed the door open and stepped inside like always, but this time I stopped him before he took 2 steps. I said I am not having visitors today. He looked surprised, offended, even as if my boundaries were a personal insult. He said Mom said you needed company. I said I am resting. He smirked. He said you get like this. I repeated calmly, I need rest. Please leave. The word please softened the dismissal without giving him anything to hold. He studied me like he was trying to figure out what had shifted. Then he muttered, "Suit yourself," and left. I wrote down every part of that interaction, too. I began saving screenshots of messages and voicemails. I took date-stamped photos of my bruises. I requested my hospital records and learned that patients were allowed to do that without anyone else's permission. The emergency room notes from the second visit included the sentence, "Patient arrived unconscious with inconsistent explanation from accompanying family." My pulse quickened reading it. Someone else had seen it. Someone else had documented the discrepancy before my family could rewrite the story. I printed the note and placed it carefully in a folder. Each piece of evidence felt like a brick in a foundation I was finally building for myself after a lifetime of standing on shifting sand. Silence became my shield. Not the fearful silence I practiced as a child, but a new deliberate silence that kept my story from being contaminated. I stopped answering questions that were designed to lead my words somewhere I did not want them to go. I stopped offering explanations. I stopped defending myself. I stopped filling conversations with details they could use. When my mother asked how I was doing, I said resting. When my father asked what my plans were, I said focusing on healing. When my brother hinted again that I had always needed direction, I said nothing at all. Silence unsettles people who depend on controlling the conversation. They needed my words to build their narrative. Without my words, their story began to lose shape. My mother sent longer messages. My father became firmer about the evaluation. My brother tried sarcasm and then impatience. None of it worked. Because while they were scrambling to gather evidence for the story, they wanted the world to believe I was gathering evidence for the truth. Every bruise, every ER note, every text, every voicemail, every twisting of my words. And with every piece of documentation I saved, the fear that once dominated my life began to transform into something else. Something colder, sharper, stronger. My silence was no longer surrender. It was preparation. The morning everything changed did not begin with chaos. It began quietly, almost gently, with a soft ache in my ribs and the faint hum of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. I reached for it slowly, half expecting another message from my mother, asking for updates, or another reminder from my father about the evaluation he was pushing. Instead, it was a number I did not recognize. The voicemail that followed was from a domestic violence advocate at the hospital. She said she had reviewed the notes from my last ER visit and wanted to check on my safety. Her voice was steady but carried a careful compassion that made something inside me soften and tighten at the same time. She said, "If you are not safe, or if you feel pressured by anyone, we can help. Call me back when you are alone." The words, "when you are alone," sent a cold realization through me. She had seen something in the notes, something my family had tried to bury beneath excuses and practiced concern. I dialed her number before I could talk myself out of it. When she answered, I felt my throat tighten as if speaking the truth would instantly unravel everything I had worked to keep contained. She asked me simple questions. "Are you safe right now? Can you speak freely? Has anyone hurt you?" I hesitated, but she did not rush me. She waited, letting silence sit softly between us instead of using it as leverage the way my family did. I told her about the second ER visit. I told her about waking up with my mother answering questions for me. I told her about the bruises and the fear and the way explanations kept twisting into accidents I never claimed. I told her about the notebook my mother kept and the way my father and brother documented things I did not say. I did not tell her everything, but I told her enough. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said your safety matters more than their story. Then she explained the emergency protective order process. She said in situations where someone may be in danger, or where coercion and control appear evident, judges could issue temporary protective orders within 24 to 48 hours. She asked if I wanted to pursue it. My first instinct was to say I was fine. That reflex lived inside me like a childhood echo. But then I remembered the ER note describing inconsistent explanation from family. I remembered my mother's gentle lies, my father's firm pressure, my brother's smirk when he said you get like this. And I remembered the documentation I had been collecting quietly, like seeds of a truth I had not been brave enough to speak aloud. So I said yes. Her voice warmed. She guided me step by step. She told me what to include in the statement. She said, focus on facts, not emotions. She said, document patterns, not isolated moments. She said, if they are building a paper trail, you need one too. I spent the next 2 hours writing the clearest, most careful account of the last months that I could. I included the emergency room records. I included the dates of each injury. I included the bruises I had photographed. I included the times my family interrupted medical staff. I included their pressure about evaluations. I included their attempts to twist my words. I included the fear that had woven itself into my life like a quiet shadow. When I finished, the advocate reviewed it with me line by line. She said, this is strong, this is clear, this is enough for a judge to consider. Then she submitted it. The waiting began. I expected panic to rise inside me, the familiar tightening of dread I had lived with for so long. But instead, I felt an unexpected stillness, a quiet that did not feel like surrender, a quiet that felt like the first deep breath after years of shallow ones. My phone rang in the early evening. It was the advocate again. Her tone had shifted, carrying a new firmness. She said the judge issued the emergency protective order, effective immediately. My heart stumbled. For a moment, I did not understand. She repeated slowly, you have a temporary protective order in place. They cannot contact you. They cannot come to your home. They cannot pressure you. They cannot interfere. You are protected until the full hearing, which will be scheduled in the next few weeks. I sat down on the edge of my bed, dizzy with relief and disbelief. For the first time, I felt a boundary that did not crumble under someone else's will. A boundary backed by law. A boundary that said the danger was real, even if my family refused to acknowledge it. The advocate explained the next steps. She said I would need to keep documenting. She said I should save any attempts at contact. She said if they tried to violate the order, I must call the police immediately. I thanked her more times than I could count. After we hung up, I stared at my silent phone. No messages from my mother. No missed calls from my father. No unsolicited drop by visits from my brother. The silence felt profound, heavy, liberating. I walked to the window. The sky was fading into evening, soft and pale. For the first time in months, my body did not tense at the creak of the floorboards or the shadow of someone walking past my door. I felt stillness settle into me, warm and trembling. I whispered to myself, I am safe for now. Not forever, not completely, but for now. It was the first moment of true relief I had felt in a very long time, and it did not come from my family. It came from the truth finally being recognized by someone with the power to act on it. The first night under the emergency protective order felt strangely peaceful, but the peace did not last. By morning, the weight of what was coming settled over me like a thick fog. The advocate had explained that the full hearing would take place in a few weeks, and until then, the order protected me, but protection did not erase fear. It only gave it a boundary to press against. Waiting became its own kind of terror. My phone stayed mostly silent, but silence had never felt so loud. Every vibration made my heart jump. Every unknown number felt like a threat. Even without contacting me directly, my family found ways to creep back into my mind. I imagined my mother rehearsing her version of events, her voice perfectly pitched with practiced concern. I imagined my father gathering documents he believed would make him look reasonable. I imagined my brother smirking as he told anyone who would listen that I had always been dramatic, that I had always needed supervision, that this was just another episode. The narrative they had built for years was not going to disappear quietly. It was going to fight, and the waiting gave it space to grow. A few days after the order was issued, the advocate called to check on me. She asked if anyone had tried to violate the order. I told her no, not directly, but I had noticed something unsettling. Friends began reaching out, saying they had heard I was going through something emotional. One said my mother told her I had become withdrawn. Another said my brother mentioned I was getting help. The words were vague enough to avoid accusations, but sharp enough to cut into my credibility. They were planting seeds. They were building the story regardless of the distance the order created. The advocate told me this was unfortunately common. Families who rely on image control often create a social buffer before legal proceedings. She reminded me that their words could not override documentation. She told me to keep saving everything, even secondhand comments, even rumors. Truth had to be traced. That night, I received a voicemail from a number I did not recognize. When I pressed play, my mother's voice filled the room, soft and trembling. She said, "We do not understand why you are doing this." She said, "We are heartbroken." She said, "Please talk to us." She said, "You are destroying the family." She never mentioned the protective order. She never acknowledged the injuries. She never said, "I am sorry" or "We want you safe." She only spoke of the damage being done to them. I saved the voicemail and added it to the folder. I replayed it once more before closing my phone. Her voice no longer made me second-guess myself. It made me recognize the pattern even more clearly. Love should not sound like a leash. A few days later, my father emailed me. He used formal language, something stiff and businesslike. He said he respected my space but wanted clarity about any upcoming legal misunderstandings. He asked if I could provide context so the family could be prepared. He wrote prepared as though he were assembling documents for a meeting rather than confronting the truth that his daughter had needed legal protection. I forwarded the email to the advocate. She responded within minutes, saying this was another tactic, pressure disguised as politeness. She told me not to reply. She said the order existed to protect me from exactly this. The waiting continued, stretching longer each day. Sleep came in fragments. I would wake in the middle of the night, convinced I heard footsteps outside or voices at my door. I knew logically the order prevented them from coming near, but fear does not follow logic. Fear follows memory. And memories of my family were rarely kind. I walked through my apartment with caution, listening for anything unusual. I checked my locks twice, sometimes 3 times. Even so, there were moments when my body remembered danger before my mind did. A sound outside, a creak in the hallway, a shadow shifting under the door. Each time I felt the same tightening in my chest. A reaction trained into me after years of being told nothing was wrong even when everything was. But not all days were dark. Some were strangely bright with small flickers of hope. I continued documenting everything. I added timestamps to photos. I requested additional copies of medical notes. I organized everything into folders labeled clearly. When I looked at the growing stack, I felt something steady strengthen beneath my ribs. My story was finally being written by me, not overshadowed by my mother's whispering concern, or my father's logical tone, or my brother's dismissive laughter. My truth had a spine now. Midway through the waiting period, my brother sent a message from someone else's phone. It said, "Think about what you are doing." It said, "You are making this worse." It said, "You get confused." I stared at the words calm for the first time. He had not changed his tactics, but I had changed mine. I screenshotted the message. I saved it. I did not respond. The quiet rage that had been building inside me did not explode. It focused. It narrowed. It crystallized. The waiting did not break me. It clarified me. There were moments of dread, yes. Moments when fear pressed its cold hands against my spine. But there were also moments of certainty. Moments when I realized that if waiting was a test, then each day I endured without breaking was proof that I was stronger than the story they tried to force around me. And when the letter finally arrived with the date of the full hearing printed in sharp black ink, I felt a mix of fear and relief so intense it nearly stole my breath. Waiting had been its own terror. But the next part would require something even harder. The next part would require me to speak. The morning of the full hearing arrived with a chill that seeped into my bones long before I stepped outside. I barely slept the night before, not because of fear exactly, but because of the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The emergency order had given me temporary protection, but the full hearing would decide the future. It would determine whether the court believed my documentation or my family's narrative. It would determine whether the truth finally had room to breathe. I dressed slowly, choosing plain clothes that felt steady on my skin. The advocate met me at the courthouse entrance, her presence grounding like a warm hand resting between my shoulders. She reminded me to breathe, to trust my documentation, to speak clearly, to let the evidence speak where my voice trembled. The courtroom was small but felt enormous. The judge sat at the front, expression neutral and watchful. Rows of chairs stretched behind me, mostly empty except for a few strangers waiting for their own hearings. Then the door opened and my family walked in. My mother spotted me first. She looked wounded, her mouth pinched with a practiced grief I recognized instantly. My father walked straighter than usual, jaw-tight folder tucked under his arm like he was attending a business review. My brother followed behind them with that familiar expression of certainty, the one he used whenever he believed he had the upper hand. They sat on the opposite side of the room, whispering among themselves. I forced myself not to look away. The judge called the case. My heart hammered, but my mind felt strangely clear. The advocate spoke first, explaining the context of the emergency order, the ER notes, the documented injuries, the pattern of control and interference. Then, my attorney presented the binder I had spent weeks assembling. Every time-stamped photo, every text message, every voicemail, every ER note, every instance where my family answered questions that were directed at me. The judge listened without interruption, eyes scanning documents, brow lowering slightly as she reached the page containing the phrase inconsistent explanation from accompanying family. Then it was my family's turn. My mother stood hands trembling just enough to appear delicate. She said she had only ever been concerned for me. She said I had been so tired lately. She said she feared I was losing touch with reality. She used words like overwhelmed and fragile and confused. I felt each word like a small, cold blade. My father added that they had encouraged counseling because they wanted me to have support. He said families sometimes miscommunicate. He insisted they had nothing to hide. He never mentioned the bruises. He never mentioned the ER. He never mentioned the way he pressured me to accept an evaluation without explaining why. My brother stepped forward last, shoulders squared. He said I had always struggled with stress. He said I tended to overreact. He said the emergency room visits were unfortunate accidents. Then he added with absolute confidence, she falls a lot. The judge raised an eyebrow. She asked calmly how many times a grown woman typically falls hard enough to require emergency medical care. My brother blinked, thrown off balance. My mother interjected quickly, saying she has always been clumsy. I felt something inside me tighten, but not in fear, in recognition. Those were the same words she used when I was brought unconscious into the ER. Those were the words that allowed my truth to be dismissed for so long. The judge flipped through the documentation again. She asked my family to explain why none of their statements matched the medical notes. She pointed out that while accidents happen, repeated injuries aligned with inconsistent explanations raised concerns. My father cleared his throat and said the doctors must have misunderstood. My mother nodded vigorously. My brother crossed his arms. The judge turned to me. She asked me to speak. My hands trembled, but my voice did not break. I told her about the injuries. I told her about the fear. I told her about waking up in the ER with my mother answering questions that should have been directed at me. I told her about the slow erosion of my voice and the way silence had become survival. I told her about the documentation I kept because I knew my words alone would not stand against years of being dismissed. I did not cry. I did not dramatize. I simply told the truth with the steady quiet that had carried me this far. When I finished, the judge leaned back slightly and studied all of us with a level, almost clinical gaze. Then she asked one final question directed at my family. She said if she is simply clumsy, then why does clumsiness consistently require emergency medical care accompanied by explanations that never match? The room went still. My mother's mouth opened, but no words came out. My father looked away. My brother narrowed his eyes as if trying to think of a retort, but there was none. The narrative they had built so carefully buckled under the weight of the question. The judge closed the file. She said, based on the evidence presented, it is clear there is a pattern of coercion and interference that jeopardizes the petitioner's safety and autonomy. She granted the long-term protective order. For one suspended moment, everything inside me went silent, not the silence of fear, the silence of something releasing, something long held finally letting go. My family sat frozen. My mother looked betrayed. My father looked stunned. My brother looked furious. But none of their reactions mattered anymore. The truth had finally been spoken in a room where their control no longer reached. The courthouse hallway emptied slowly after the judge delivered her ruling, but I stayed seated for a long moment, hands resting in my lap, feeling the weight of the words I had carried for years finally settle into something solid and undeniable. I did not fall. I repeated it silently, letting the truth echo in places inside me I had never let myself touch before. When I finally stood, my legs felt unsteady, not from fear, but from release, as though my body was adjusting to the absence of tension that had lived inside me for so long it had become a second spine. My advocate walked beside me to the elevator, telling me I had been brave, but the word felt almost foreign. I had not felt brave. I had felt tired. I had felt cornered. I had felt pushed into a silence that had nearly swallowed me. But now, stepping out into the cool afternoon air, I felt something new taking shape. Something like steadiness. I drove home slowly, noticing small details I had ignored for months. The way sunlight fell across the dashboard, the hum of traffic in the distance, the faint scent of cedar from the air freshener I kept meaning to replace. My body felt lighter in small ways, as if my shoulders were finally allowed to drop from a place they had been braced for years. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, breathing in the quiet. For the first time, silence did not feel like danger. It felt like space. The emergency order had kept my partner away, but the long-term protective order meant something deeper. It meant my safety was not a temporary pause. It meant the law had acknowledged what I had lived through. It meant my family could no longer interfere with my care or my decisions. And most importantly, it meant I was no longer alone inside the truth. That evening, I sat with my journal, the one where I had documented every bruise, every doctor visit, every broken excuse. I flipped through the pages slowly. They no longer made me shake. They did not make me question my memory. They did not make me feel ashamed. They made me feel validated. They made me feel strong. I closed the journal and set it on a shelf high above my desk, not hidden anymore, but kept as a record of what I survived and what I refused to return to. In the following days, the changes came quietly. My sleep improved first. Instead of waking abruptly to sounds that reminded me of past nights, I slept in longer stretches, my body testing the idea of safety like a cautious animal stepping into open space. I cooked meals again. Simple things: soup, rice, vegetables. Food I could prepare without rushing. I visited my therapist weekly, then twice weekly, not because I was falling apart, but because I was ready to heal intentionally. She told me recovery is not a straight line. She said I would have days where the old fears returned in sudden waves, and days where I would feel weightless. She warned me not to mistake healing for forgetting. I nodded. I did not want to forget. I wanted to understand. My family reached out only once after the hearing. A message from my mother that said we still love you even if we do not understand why you are doing this. I read it twice, then set my phone down. There was no anger in me, only clarity. I no longer needed their understanding to validate my experience. I no longer needed to shrink so they could feel comfortable. I did not reply. Instead, I blocked their numbers not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Distance was not punishment, it was oxygen. My brother posted online about families tearing apart over misunderstandings indirect enough to avoid naming me, but sharp enough to land where he intended. People sent the post to me asking if I was okay. I ignored it. The noise of his opinions no longer reached me. What mattered was truth, not performance. Weeks later, my therapist asked what I wanted moving forward. The question startled me. For so long, my life had been about surviving, predicting, tiptoeing, coping. Want was a luxury I had forgotten. I took a long breath before answering. I told her I wanted quiet mornings without fear. I wanted friendships not shaped by secrecy. I wanted to choose my own path, my own pace, my own safety. I wanted to live without apologizing for existing. She smiled gently and said, "Then that is where we start." Healing did not come in dramatic moments. It came in small rituals, morning walks, filling my apartment with sunlight, keeping my phone on silent without guilt, learning that I could set boundaries and not crumble from the weight of them, learning that I did not need to explain every decision, learning to recognize tenderness without flinching. Some nights I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who believed she deserved the pain because her family insisted she was dramatic, clumsy, difficult. I sat with her gently as though she were someone I was finally ready to protect instead of abandon. She had survived without proof, without allies, without support. She deserved softness. She deserved truth, and the truth was simple. I didn't fall. I was pushed. Not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically, systematically, pushed into believing my own pain was an inconvenience. But now I stood. I stood in my own story, in my own voice, in my own name. And for the first time in my life, it was enough. To the viewers hearing my story, I say this: family is not defined by blood. Family is defined by those who refuse to let you disappear. If my story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, subscribe to the channel, and pass this story to someone who may need it. Your voice matters. Your courage matters. You matter. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what part of this journey resonated with you. And if you know someone who might need strength or clarity, share this video with them today and make sure you subscribe so you never miss another story that reminds us that survival is not weakness and speaking the truth is its own kind of courage.